Hi, Bjorn.
Hi.
Oh, Bjorn, I'm so thrilled to have you on the podcast, and I guess I'd really like to start by thanking you for writing just the most beautiful book, I May Be Wrong, which this last week has just brought me so much joy and so much comfort and has given me so many things to think about. So thank you, first of all.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful to hear. That's the first praise from the English edition that I've ever heard. This warms the cockles of my heart.
Well, it's praise that's massively due because it's just stunning, and I'm gutted that I finished reading it now. I'm like, oh gosh, what the hell am I going to read next? It's so beautiful. So the book starts off telling the incredible story of how in your 20s, when you had a really high-powered job in finance, you made this decision. It kind of seems like out of the blue to become a forest monk. And I'd love you to tell me a bit more about that feeling that pulled you to change the course of your life so much.
Well, I guess, the popular version tends to exaggerate, so sounds like I catapulted from the executive suite to the jungle, but it's a bit more complicated than that. But I was working in Spain. I was about to become the youngest CFO of a subsidiary of a large Swedish multinational ever. And it was Sunday, and I was having what we in Swedish call Sunday anguish, that slightly depressing or not so slightly depressing feeling of here's another work week in front of me and I'm not looking forward to any aspect of it. And I was in my sofa. I had recently read the 70s classic Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. You're probably too young for it, but it was one of those books that became popular in the hippie era, Eastern wisdom, light version, so to speak, quite philosophical actually. And in that book, I'd picked up the notion that in the stillness, in the quietude of our minds, which is always there is something valuable there. And so that was an intriguing notion, not totally new, but it was formulated in a way that really got my attention. And so I just kind of lay down in the sofa and I thought, what do people do when they meditate? All I know is they seem to be awfully occupied by breathing. So I thought, well, I'll try it. So I just followed a few breaths, and of course my thoughts, they came and went on other topics. I never could take more than 3 or 4 breaths fully aware and then, my thoughts would go off. But no, on a relative level, nothing fancy or mysterious, but my inner life quietened down a little bit, because that's what happened when we start to become, the active observer of our thinking rather than being identified with them. So, relative quiet appeared, and those thoughts about the heavy week ahead was kind of lightened and didn't seem so oppressive. And then there was this completely, how do I explain it? You know how sometimes a thought comes to you as out of nowhere? It doesn't feel like you've thought it. It bubbles up from another place than the usual inside. And it was very short and very convinced. And it said, it didn't kind of use words in some way, but the sense was, it's time to move on. It's time to move on. Very simple. And, then my intellect took over. So I started reasoning with myself. What are my parents going to say? What's my boss going to say? What am I going to do instead? I'm letting people down. And then the other side, but it's my life. I'm still young. I have many possibilities. I'm not contracted to do this for life. It's my life. And very quickly, I just I got settled in, yes, this decision came from a very unusual place in me. It wasn't the end result of a process of reflection or thinking. Of course, I'd thought about my job occasionally, everybody does. But I'd never really seriously considered quitting and just walking away. And so sometimes when I talk or write, I use that situation to remind people that we have several ways of coming to decisions, we humans, or to insight, if you like. One way is the intellect, We reason our way through something where we need to make up our minds. And that's a wonderful, lovely quality. No other beings on this planet seem to have it as we do. But it's not the only tool in the toolkit, if you like. And sometimes we forget that we also have something which, some people call it intuition. The Buddhists tend to call it wisdom. I sometimes use the expression, the intelligence of the moment, to not make it sound too spiritual, if you like. Sometimes when we have some access to the stillness that's always there inside, a solution, an answer, an idea can just appear quite ready. It's already ready. It doesn't need shaping up. So that's what happened to me. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time I was really conscious of what happened.
You can't really ignore that sort of inner voice.
Exactly.
Even if it's not words forming, that feeling, when you can differentiate it between, like you've just said, coming up with pros and cons and then settling on an idea versus like a fully formed idea that comes to you. I've had it myself, and
I'm sure you have.
You can't not act on it. It's so,
no.
and if you do ignore it, it just gets louder and louder.
Exactly.
And I love that you describe it in the book as the first decision that you'd ever made without anxiously looking over your shoulder.
Exactly.
For some sort of like nudge. Yep, go on, you've made the right choice here. And I think we forget how infrequently we do that, how infrequently we make decisions without someone else egging us on. I guess, again, that points to a decision that comes from a place of wisdom. You don't need someone to back up the idea. You just have to do it.
Exactly. And it's like a wonderful thing. And as I've become more attuned to this and interested in this over many years now, I notice so well that the body knows the truth.
Yeah.
There's a response from the body where a voice speaks to you from your intuitive, wisest side. And that's so lovely. The body has its own intelligence. I can often feel just like, a little shiver or a vibration, or you feel like you're being slightly moved or something. It's just, the body recognizes the truth when it sees or hears it.
I guess to experience that clarity, whether it's cognitive or physical, there does have to be a sense of stillness, because we're so easily distracted in the modern world with, technology or food or gossip or whatever it is, that we can become quite numb to all of these signs and voices that might be speaking to us. So I guess a level of stillness is usually needed to allow us to hear that inner voice or feeling.
Yeah, I'd agree. But my only caution is I don't want to make this too spiritual or mystical, because it's something that every human being experiences more or less often. But there are certain conditions that support it. And I would say, clarity or calm are two of them. I ended up becoming a Buddhist monk for 17 years after business life. And the master who started the tradition that I belonged to was a wonderful Thai man called Ajahn Chah. And he once compared it to, when you have I don't know the English word for it, but a really, really small lake in a forest where the wind doesn't reach,
Maybe just a little pond, we could
call
it?
Yeah, a little pond, If the pond is... if there's mud in the water, so it's muddy, and you have leaves on top, or maybe the wind affects the surface, if you pick away the leaves, if the wind stops, if the mud falls to the bottom, then all of a sudden you can see, that's a stone, that's some little algae, that's a piece of wood, that's sand. So basically, calm can help you to see things clearer. And it's not always necessary. I think we all have many examples of when, a situation with great distress where we feel really pressured by life. And for some reason, somehow, I think it has to do with surrendering to the moment. We find ourselves knowing exactly what to do within a split second. And we can access that place also, when life is not clear and calm and still and all that. But it's a little overlooked an overlooked resource in human inner life. I was so pleased when I found this quote by Albert Einstein. He said once that reason is a servant, intuition is a gift. We have made the servant a master and forgotten the gift.
Oh
Isn't
gosh.
that lovely? Isn't that lovely?
God, well, we need to take heed of that, I think, more now than ever.
Yeah.
We really do, because the state of the world at the moment seems to be a magnified version of what you've just described in that quote. And we have to, understand that we all have that innate wisdom. It's like you say, it's there for everyone. It's we just overlook it or don't, I guess, give it the respect that it deserves. So look, I'd love to talk then about this incredible 17 years you had as a forest monk. Can you describe what the experience was like of entering that sort of life, coming from Sweden and like you've just described, having that, sort of Sunday angst and going into a busy working week? How did you integrate into a monastic life?
It was the weirdest thing, I read this book, about a year before I became a monk in Sweden. By then, I was a practicing Buddhist, meditating every day, quite starry-eyed and newborn Buddhist. And I found this book called Seeing the Way, and it described how men and women, mainly from the West, lived as monks and nuns in Thailand in an English-speaking monastery. And there were like essays and talks and guided meditations, Q&As, and that really fired me up. So I gave everything away that I owned. I paid off my student debt and gave what was left to my parents, and off I went. And so I come to this poorest part of Thailand. It's called the Isarn. It's close to where Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand meet. And, the first night I stayed in town, I washed my hair in the morning, and I thought, this may be the last time I wash my hair in my whole life. And took a little tuk-tuk, these three-wheeler Thai taxis, to the monastery. You come in, outside it's like rice paddies and rather hot and flat and not very pretty countryside really. And then you come in through this valve. Do you say valve? Like you have trees like a tunnel around you.
Like a little valley maybe?
Yeah. Like it's a path, but it's tree covered all around. So it's like being in a tunnel made of trees. And then you come up to a beautiful meditation hall in the middle of the jungle with like humongous windows without glass in them. And I came at the time when the monks were eating, and it was very obvious that this is not the time to go up and talk. So after the meal was finished, I kind of went up on my knees to the abbot, as it's done in Thailand, and I was quite, solemn, Basically, I've given everything up, I've given everything away, I've come to ordain as a forest monk, here I am. And the abbot, he was a Canadian, ex-hockey player, ex-lumberjack, and he was so non-ceremonial about it. Yeah, fine. You can check in the male dormitory. If you stay for more than 3 days, you'll have to shave off your hair, Welcome. So, I've got quite a lot in this, and he doesn't seem very impressed. But then after years, I realized you have young, starry-eyed men, because they're more often men than women, coming to the monastery every week, doing more or less the same thing as I did. This is it. I've given everything up. I'm going to be a forest monk. And, within a week, half of them are on their way to Bangkok with a train again, because the reality didn't match up with their expectations. And so he'd seen that so many times. But for me, it was different. I mean, the lifestyle is extreme. It's totally weird from an outside perspective. You get up at 3 o'clock in the morning at the latest. You stumble your way across the jungle, hoping not to step on any snakes or worse. And then you meditate at 3:30 together. You bow to Buddha statues. In a forest monastery, there are Buddhist statues pretty much in every room. And you never sit down in a room without bowing to the Buddha statue 3 times before. So you bow a lot. Bowing didn't mean anything to me. I mean, I have no relationship to bowing. to an image. And then you chant, it's a language nobody has spoken for 1,000 years. And then you sit still and meditate, not unusually while the mosquitoes are having breakfast on your body. And I kept falling asleep all the time when I meditated, but only for the first 8 or 9 years.
Wow.
So, and it's like, I imagine that part of my reasoning when choosing to become a Buddhist monk was finally I'll get away from other people and get some me time, And then when I come to the monastery, I realize I've just checked in the most eccentric collective I've ever even been near. And it's 7/24, 365. There's no holidays, no weekends or evenings off, And I just realized I didn't expect this, but social training is going to be a large part of my monastic life. If I don't learn to be a little bit more grand-hearted, forgiving, and tolerant, I'm gonna go down here.
I'm so interested in that sort of unusual aspect of life that you've just talked about, the weirdness perhaps to the outsiders, that we would view monastic life as something with, well, like you state in the book, I can't remember the exact number, but there's over 200 rules for forest monks and even more for nuns. But over that 17 years, you talk about life in a way that seems there was perhaps way more freedom than you'd ever experienced, although you're living within a set of such rigid rules. And I wonder, how do you get that sense of freedom with so many boundaries in place, I guess?
Yeah. Well, just imagine, I didn't touch a coin or a bill or a credit card for 17 years. I had nothing to do with money. Imagine all the things you don't need to concern yourself with if you're not in the market for buying and selling. That's tremendous. You have very few possessions, not extreme, but you have, when my 6th year as a monk, I did a 500-kilometer pilgrimage, you could say, from a hermitage where I'd spent a year to my monastery. And I carried everything I own in this world on my shoulders. I was maybe 20 pounds at the most. So, you live lightly. You changed within the monastery, you tend to change dwelling, your hut every month or so. So you don't really get too cozy in your dwelling because I'll move to another one soon. So you learn to just, live lightly and not make too much of your particular home or your particular possessions. And those, there's some peace in, imagine having only possessions that you can repair yourself. We sewed our own robes, I know in Sweden we have one of the classes we have to take when we're young is sewing. So, I had some advantage being Swedish. I was used to sewing machines. So with these old, antiquated, non-electrical, foot-driven sewing machines, we made our robes. We made our toothbrushes from wood from the local forest. It's like you basically don't have any technology that you don't understand and can't handle yourself. That's a type of freedom too.
Yeah, it's so interesting and beautiful to learn about this way of thinking and this way of life, because ultimately you're not having any attachments to anything, materialistic or otherwise. And like you even describe in the book, you can't have food preferences necessarily. You're just given what you're given once a day and you eat it. There's little attachment to preferences. And
I have to correct you there, Fearne. There's plenty of attachments. You don't get to satisfy them. That's the difference.
Right. Okay. So you're constantly having to practice that
before
one.
I was a monk, when I was like a layman in the monastery, as everybody is in the beginning, the monastery helps you renewing your visa when you're a monk or a nun, but not when you're not. So I was planning for my trip to Malaysia, Penang, where they have a Thai consulate, to renew my Thai visa. And because I was falling asleep so much sitting meditation, I tended to do a lot of walking meditation. And I noticed I could have one-pointed, unbroken attention while walking on my walking meditation path for an hour on what pizza places and ice cream parlors I was going to visit in Penang. So, you know, when there's some desire involved, we can be very one-pointed.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. And it's kind of sweet, you know, because it's like Ajahn Chah, one of the wonderful things he said was 95% of a forest monk's life is trying to let go of something and not being able to. But then Thai society is very allowing. So it's, you know, I think we have some shame and guilt inheritance in this part of the world. But Thais don't seem to have that very much. So nobody is pretending they're a saint, you know. So we had a lot of fun, you know, because it's kind of part of the culture to mildly joke about oneself. So imagine the combo, basically a Anglo-Saxon culture, because maybe half of us came from English-speaking countries, and then on top of that, the Buddhist idea that identifying with every thought and emotion and bodily phenomena is not such a great idea. You get quite, you know, you get a skillful way of just making fun of ourselves, making fun of each other. I was at a radio interview a few years ago, and I'm always interested when there's a question I've never heard before. And the reporter asked, "Did you laugh most before, during, or after your monk years?" And the answer was immediate. While I was a monk, I laughed more, you know. We had a lot of fun.
Well, that's it. Like you just said, you know, in the West, we do have a lot of guilt and shame. We've done whole episodes of the podcast on those emotions.
I can imagine.
Brené Brown, she came on the podcast just the other week, and this is the thing. I think the propensity for us to fall into those sort of categories, it just annihilates joy and laughter immediately.
It does.
I guess self-compassion allows you to have that sense of fun and a lack of seriousness about all of this stuff.
I would say, like, you know, if I was to summarize, you know, like I did an MBA at Sweden's most prestigious business school before I became a monk, you know, before my career in finance. And some of those friends, they asked me afterwards, you know, like, what's your achievement, you know? They look at the monk's life as, you know, what's the takeaway, you know? What's your unique selling point? And I said, well, sometimes I say, you know, the best reward from 17 years as a Buddhist monk is I've just become a better friend with myself.
Yeah.
I'm better with me in times of difficulty, in times of happiness. I'm just easier company to myself. And I can imagine if that sounds a bit weird, but I think most of your listeners will recognize that there tends to be a voice in most of us which goes rather quiet when we do things well and can get very loud and not very generous when we say something we hadn't quite considered or do something we hadn't quite thought through, or we're late to something, or we get something barking up the wrong trouser leg or whatever.
Yeah.
So that I had that voice, very critical, very harsh. And that's just kind of, for one, it's grown milder. And for one, I've learned that I don't really take it at face value anymore. I'm more aware. So, here goes that sad, tired old voice telling me I'm no good just because I made some pretty human mistake.
Yeah. And we forget that the more we do that and we sort of punish ourselves for making, as you said, you know, we're fallible humans making human mistakes, we're even less generous with our forgiveness towards others. We become you know, even more uptight about other people making mistakes, which is, again, it's going to annihilate joy in a very short time. And I loved in the book that you said one of the other things that you value hugely from your 17 years as a forest monk is that you just don't believe every thought in your head anymore. And I think, you know, everyday humans have a real problem with this. We all believe all of it. We believe every single thought to be true. So how do we start to change that habit?
Well, you know, it's kind of that particular piece. On a way, it's so simple that it can be overlooked. Yeah. But actually, if you take it on, it's profound. what tends to happen in meditation, as I'm sure you're well aware, is you sit there and you're told to focus on something, maybe your breath or maybe a little inner word or maybe some other physical sensations or the heart or whatever. And then you notice maybe for the first time, goodness me, I thought I was a rational human being that thought about what I wanted when I wanted. And you realize it's chaos in there. I'm telling myself I should focus on my breathing right now.
Yeah.
And then I go off on a million tangents about other places, other times, other people. And so that's the first discovery, you know. Yeah. And then as you kind of learn introspection through meditation, you realize I'm not really thinking my feelings. I'm not really thinking my thoughts. Like these thoughts, they just come to me. I'm like a radio, you know. And a lot of our thoughts are just conditioned patterns, you know. And so after 1,000, 100,000, 10 million times of, whoops, here's another distracting thought, I'll just let it go and go back to the breathing. You slowly develop a new relationship to your thinking process where you don't automatically believe everything you think at face value.
Yeah.
And that's tremendous. You know, imagine if a few more politicians a bit more often could remember, I may be wrong. Maybe it's a good idea to not believe every thought I have. Every position I have.
Wouldn't that be like the biggest miracle ever and something ever. We just need, because I feel like, well, it's a fact. We all know we're living in the most divisive times where everybody is very, very wedded to the opinion of the world around them and how things should be. And I love the story you tell, which, you know, gave you the name of your book, I May Be Wrong. Do you mind sharing that story with us now? Because I've been thinking about this relentlessly since I read it.
You know, the Canadian guy I told you about that was the abbot when I arrived, after a few years he left for California to start a new branch monastery there. And then an Englishman took over. His name is Ajahn Jayasaro. He's one of the most brilliant men I've ever met. And one of the unusual things about him is he's not only intellectually brilliant, but his heart is open and they communicate with each other. So he made an impression. Basically for 4 years when he was the abbot, I would be like, if I see his lips move, could the world please quieten down? Because I do not want to miss a word. And so we had a lunar calendar, so every full moon, new moon, and a half moon rising and falling, we'd meet in the main meditation hall to meditate all night. You can imagine it a bit like a Buddhist Sunday. So you'd have like 150 or 200 villagers, some people from Bangkok maybe, you know, just people who were, disciples?
Yeah.
Or parishioners. And they'd come and sit and meditate with us for the night. And you know, we'd bow, we'd chant, we'd meditate. And then at midnight, the drinks came in, coffee and tea. It was extremely welcome, especially by people like myself who tended to fall asleep while meditating. And then after the coffee, he climbs up into the high seat. There's like a tradition in Buddhism that the person giving a talk should sit a bit higher out of respect for the teachings, not out of respect for him or her personally. You know, so he climbs up into the high seat, sits down with his legs crossed. There's 2 huge brass Buddhas at the front of the room and lots of candles and lotus flowers and incense. And everybody is like very attentive because he was a loved and respected teacher. And so he starts I was using his talks to try to learn Thai because he speaks a bit slower and more easy, or his pronunciation is clearer than most of the Thai people. So, you know, he basically started out saying, tonight I'm going to give you a magic mantra. And the villagers and the monks, we were all very surprised because the forest tradition is kind of known for not being so interested in magical, mystical stuff. For a lot of people in Thailand, that's where it's at. They're really interested in all that. But the forest tradition tends to shy away from that a bit. That's not the point. So here the Western forest teacher tells us we're going to get a magic mantra. Everybody's really surprised. And then he says, you know, the next time you have a problem arising on your horizon, the next time you feel like you're just about to get into an unnecessary conflict with somebody, just whisper this mantra 3 times internally, and you'll see how your difficulties will evaporate like, dew on a sunny morning. And we're all like listening, he's got us all in his hand. And he says, are you ready? Okay, here it comes. I may be wrong. I may be wrong. I may be wrong. And, that's 20 years ago I heard it. Wow. And to me, no, it's 25 years ago. And to me, it's still the perfect mantra. Imagine a world where a few more of us remembered that a little bit more often. Imagine how much we'd learn from talking to each other. Imagine how good it would feel to tell somebody else about something that's important or difficult for you. Imagine how political life would look if people remembered that mantra a bit more often.
Oh, it's exactly, again, what we need to be, because it goes, I guess it leads us to listen to people properly, because if we're willing to step down from our own, tightly wound up ideas about how we view ourselves in the world and where we fit into it, how we view the world around us, if we can loosen our grip on that, it's freeing, a great place to listen, but also it's humbling. Like a lot of this stuff, it's humbling to dismantle everything we believe about the world and ourselves. And, certainly not easy, but I guess that's the point of it, to be humbled by life.
Yeah, it's not easy, but it's not quite hard either when you start to see the advantages. I mean, I think, for example, that probably every human being knows the difference between telling somebody something where the other person is really with you and taking your story in, and when the other person feels like they're formulating what they're going to say as soon as you stop speaking. Yeah. It's 2 totally different experiences.
Perhaps we need to reframe culturally how we just view life, because of course if you're having a disagreement with someone, the desired outcome very subconsciously is for you to win, for you to have won the argument, to be the one who was right. But if we're going along this lines of thinking, we're ending up at the true beautiful conclusion that could be the destination, which is a bit of peace, where nobody has to be right or wrong, but you've all listened to each other. But we're missing the mark by going, I have to win. I must win this argument. Exactly. I need to be right. It's a terrible shame.
It is. Since I stopped being a monk, even before I stopped being a monk, I follow a lay teacher, somebody who's not a monk, who's called Adyashanti, an American my age, in his 60 or so. And once we were sitting at a retreat in summer in Holland, and he said something that I've never forgotten. I'll see if I can get it right. It was along the lines of the best way to make sure somebody stays exactly the same is to internally demand that they change. And if you want somebody to become a more enjoyable, free version of themselves, then, let's say you have a difficult person in your life who doesn't, in some context or other. This ongoing inner or even voiced intention or wish we may have that the other person change and be less so or more so, whatever quality, that's like the surest way of making sure they stay the same.
Yeah.
But if you want the opposite, if you want them to become more enjoyable for you and less annoying, there's a surefire way of doing that. And that's learning to love them just as they are.
Yeah.
Everybody responds so well, consciously or not consciously, towards just feeling welcome, accepted, appreciated, not judged. It's like pure medicine for the human psyche.
And I guess applying again that wonderful mantra, I may be wrong, because we probably are wrong about that person or what their intention is or why they're like they are.
Yeah. Like they shouldn't interrupt me. They should have invited me.
Yeah.
Well, should they really? We have reality here and you're arguing with reality. There's a wonderful American teacher called Byron Katie. And, she has this kind of broad American drawl. And she'd said something like, I notice when I argue with reality, I lose, but only 100% of the time. So the notion of the word should, you should be more like that or do less of this. No, because that's not obviously what's happening.
Well, exactly.
You can still have ideals. That's a wonderful thing to have ideals. And in one's personal life to aim towards being more of this or less of that for a good reason. But to demand that the world around you adjust to your ideals, that's not very realistic.
Yeah, she did a brilliant interview with Russell Brand on his podcast, actually, that I so enjoyed. It was...
she's brilliant.
It was really wonderful. And I guess looking at the sort of humbling nature of life when you start to deep dive like this, another, I guess it is a very humbling discovery that we can all stumble upon, is that most of our own suffering is self-inflicted, and we don't want to hear that. We really don't. We want it to be someone else's fault, something else is accountable for our own suffering. But nearly all of the time, that's not the case, would you say?
I would say all of the time, because there's only one human being in this universe that can assuredly inflict psychological suffering upon me. And that's the one I see in the bathroom mirror every morning, Other people do what they do. And I think it's almost like, I'm sounding a bit dogmatic here perhaps, but why not? I think it's an unavoidable step in the evolution of human consciousness, if you like, to stop pointing finger and blaming others for the difficulties in our lives and look at the part that we ourselves have the responsibility for. And that's often thoughts including a should,
Yeah.
He should, they should, my parents should have. The worst ones are, of course, I should. They're very harsh and difficult. Some wise person said, notice when you're pointing the finger with blame at somebody, may there be a clue in looking at which direction most fingers point towards. Now, if you point your index finger away, your 3 fingers below that, they will point right back at you.
That's so brilliant. And it's so true. It's so true. And
it's also so empowering.
Yes.
Because it's like, I can't do that much. I mean, even changing myself seems near impossible a lot of the time. So starting to change others, well, good luck,
Yeah.
But, the one I can develop a more supportive, loving, forgiving, upbeat relationship to is the one I'm with from morning till night every day.
Yeah.
And it's no small, we were, like when we were like a cultural experiment in Thailand, because we were Westerners, most of us, planted into a totally Asian experience.
Yeah.
And one of the things that our teachers noticed that, whoa, these Westerners don't really like themselves very much.
Yeah.
And so we were encouraged to do a bit more of the loving kinds of meditation than the Thais, because they seem to have like a healthy self-esteem right from the start. And so, when you look at the Buddhist scriptures, the Buddha selected 4 qualities of the human heart that he described as divine abidings, like where the gods dwell emotionally. And they're, of course, loving kindness. They're, of course, compassion. And it's a quality that's not so much spoken of, but it's called mudita, sympathetic joy, the capacity of the human heart to rejoice at the well-being or when things go well for oneself or others. And the 4th is equanimity, which perhaps doesn't sound very emotional to us, but it is. It's a profound state of acceptance. And then when the Buddha described how you develop these qualities inside yourself, it was always the same pattern. You always have to start with yourself. The beautiful emotion you cannot sense for yourself, you will not be able to sense for others. And that was so awkward for us, Most of us were quite happy to develop a sense of compassion with people or animals in distress or whatnot. But to develop a true sense of compassion for yourself, like another human being, imperfect, doing their best, getting it right sometimes, getting it wrong sometimes, but doing their best, I'm with them morning till night every day. Yeah. Why not have some compassion?
Why are we in such bad shape with that in the West? Why do we
I
have
wonder.
such a lack of... Is it advertising or like what's got us to that
I think
place?
it's a lot older. You know, the Dalai Lama was sitting in Dharamsala talking to a group of Western meditation teachers, some well-known names. Somebody recorded it, so I listened to it on a cassette tape in the monastery in Thailand. And one of the Western teachers brings this topic up and says, you know, Westerners have a lot of guilt and shame and finding it hard to like themselves. And the Dalai Lama took a while because the notions of guilt and shame were not very familiar to him. And then he said, oh, that's really sad. In Tibet, we don't consider anybody an adult until they like themselves.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a different statement, isn't it?
Wow.
And we almost have like a caution around that. What would the world look like if everybody walked around being friends with themselves, even liking themselves and perceiving themselves in a forgiving light, you know?
I think in the UK we've taken that one to the extreme as well, you know, sort of self-deprecating, sometimes with humour, but other times laced with a lot more toxicity than that, and it's sad. You know, I count myself in that group. It's a tricky one, and it's a daily discipline, I guess, as well.
Swedes are pretty good at it too.
I'd love to talk to you about that, you know, a moment of stillness a long way down the line, 17 years into your monastic life, where, again, you heard that inner whisper or that visceral feeling that it was time again for change and for you to leave your life as a monk and head back to Sweden. Was that a hard voice to listen to?
Ooh, that was very inconvenient, you
Yeah.
know. After 7 years in Thailand, I was a little bit tired of mainly living with men, you know, because the nun situation is not great in Thailand. But my tradition had started a nun's tradition in England, in West Sussex, and I'd met some of these nuns in Thailand when they came passing through, and I'd read some books of the teacher in West Sussex. The monastery was in Chithurst, and I just loved those books. I was so in awe of them. And so I traveled to England with the help of my parents, of course. They were pretty pleased to have me a lot closer to home. And I also passed through Sweden, of course, in summer. It was an interesting experience. And I started living in England for 7 years. And then I got quite busy in England because I became part of the management team of the monastery. And so after 7 years, I wasn't quite, you know, like a manager, but I was getting very busy in running the monastery. And we did plenty of psychological work in England on the side, as it were. I was interested in that. And so I decided to move to Switzerland, where everybody knows the Swiss. They organize everything better than everybody else. So I didn't have to organize everything in Switzerland. And I love the mountains. So our monastery in Switzerland was high up in the Berner Oberland, you know, the Swiss Alps. And some part into my second year, it was afternoon, I'd had my little nap. I lit my incense and my candle and bowed to my wooden Buddha image and sat down to meditate. And by now I've meditated every day for over 20 years, so I don't fall asleep very much anymore. And, you know, a very familiar stillness kind of became apparent or descended. And it lasted, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 minutes. And I just enjoyed that, a bit like a warm bath. And then out of this silence, this very familiar voice, same voice I'd heard in my sofa as a young executive, whispered again, it's time to move on. This time the reaction was different. Oh, this is so inconvenient. I have a good life. I know my roles. I'm part of a global community. I have a sense of meaning. But as you said before, you know, I also knew you overlook this voice at your own peril.
Yeah.
So I took some time, talked to some senior monks and nuns that I felt extra close to, talked to some ex-monastics. Of course, people don't do this for life, so I knew a lot of ex-monks and ex-nuns by this time. I had a therapist, a wonderful Scottish woman that's been with me for almost 30 years now.
Wow.
I talked to her regularly, and I realized, well, I need to follow this decision. And so it was lovely when I called my mother and said, you know, my monk days are over, I'm coming home.
Yeah.
You know, my parents visited me pretty much every year during my monk years. And so my mum had just been to the Swiss monastery, and it becomes apparent what she thought of the Swiss monastery when you hear her response. You know, she said, well, yeah, you're a bit too young to retire. So like her perception of the Swiss monastery was like an old people's home, you know. You got your room, you got your slippers outside your room, you get fed twice a day. And so I came home, and most of the ex-monastics, they had told me before that, you know, if you're like most of us, you will underestimate the pain of not being part of a collective any longer.
Yeah.
So there I am in Sweden, you know, I had a fairly serious illness called ITP. I was diagnosed in London by a not so emotionally intelligent doctor who came out with the test results and told me, you're a walking bomb. And so, you know, my blood had lost its ability to coagulate. So I was sick, I was poor, didn't have a cent to my name. Unemployed, I was single, no plan. It wasn't like, I'm going to stop being a monk because I want to do this instead.
Yeah.
I had nothing else that I wanted to do. Most of my fellow monks and nuns who left, they left for romantic reasons.
Yeah.
You know, they might have met somebody that they wanted to live out, you know, a romantic relationship with, or they were just longing for it. For me, it wasn't quite like that. You know, staying in a fairly strict celibacy was all right for me. So I didn't have like a plan B. And I was really depressed in the beginning. I had like serious anguish. You know, I'd often wake up in my little small house in the garden of a larger house. A parent of a friend let it to me for almost no money. And I wake up at 2-3 in the morning with just, you know, the bed would be wet from, some of us when we have real anguish, we sweat, you know. And so I'd kind of redo the bed with fresh linen. I'd realize if I try to fall asleep, those dark thoughts are gonna engulf me. And so I just lay in bed awake, trying to let the tension rest in the body. Can I feel the duvet on top of me? Can I feel the weight of the body against the mattress? And I just stay out of thinking in the body experience. And so I say that sometimes just to make a point that the best meditation teacher or spiritual teacher I ever had was anguish. Because it's so frightening. Anybody who's had true anguish knows it's really frightening.
Yeah.
And the worst thing is that you may have lots of friends around you and they may tell you, hey, everything else has passed. Nothing horrible has ever lasted. The sun always comes back, and you hear them, your mind understands what they're saying, but your whole system is just feeling not this time.
Yeah.
And everything you experience, see, hear, it just goes through this filter of darkness, futility, helplessness, aloneness. It's a deeply frightening experience.
It's the worst. I had a big period of depression myself about 10 years ago, and I'm intrigued to know, with your 17 years of monastic life prior to that, what did you learn from that dark time?
Well, it was like a double whammy, as the Americans say, you know, because first of all, I feel really, really bad because I'm depressed and I have anguish 4 or 5 nights a week. And on top of that, my imagined expectation from the world around me is, well, you've worked on yourself. You've been in the personal development scene for 17 years now. Shouldn't you be beyond such problems? You know, my dad even said it, as I was, the only people I was comfortable hanging out with in this period of my life were my parents, because their love is unconditional. And my dad just said once, you know, somehow I'd thought you'd be able to manage these things after 17 years as a Buddhist monk. And of course I thought it. And to tell you the truth, for me, the solution came mainly from other people. You know, like I have some kind of a media karma somehow. So, you know, when I was a young monk in Thailand, the Swedish famous TV presenter, she found me and made a program, and that became very popular and viewed. And then her husband was producer for a big Saturday night, biggest BBC equivalent channel. Or just a second. Hallå? Kan ni ställa dem utanför? Ställer ni dem utanför? Tack. Sorry. My carer, he's gone away to buy cat food and cat sand.
Oh.
And so I get a lot of flowers right now from people send me flowers, so they were doing a delivery and nobody's there to receive them.
Oh.
So anyway, back to the story. Where was I? Yes. So, this husband of the TV presenter had a program, so I was invited to do that. And it was this weird experience of my entire system is just screaming no. I feel like a failure. I'm depressed. I don't want to show myself to the world. I just want to hide away in my little small hut in a forest and see another season of Desperate Housewives. Please leave me alone. I had a certain, hunger for glamour after 17 years as a monk.
That's brilliant.
But then I hear my mouth say, yes, I'd love to. And so I go and do this, And that was well received. And then one thing that went to another. And, some friends invited me to their offices to, tell the employees about my experiences, what I learned as a Buddhist monk. And one thing led to another. And pretty soon I was working full-time as a public speaker in the kind of inspirational category, I guess. And I really enjoyed that. And then, other people gave me the sense of, even though I feel like I have nothing to offer and I feel quite lost, other people seem to quite enjoy when I share my stories and my reflections. They don't seem to be bringing out the tar and the feathers very often. And then I met my wife. And so you can imagine what that was like after 17 years in a fairly strict celibate. She told me not so long ago that, for the first 6 months of our relationship, you were pretty much like a baby monkey. You just wanted to hang around my neck all the time.
Oh, that's adorable.
True. It was a absolutely enormous hunger for physical closeness.
Oh, you talk about your wife so beautifully in the book. I was brought to tears on so many occasions with how you talk about her and how, I don't know if this is the language that you would use, but that sort of feeling of having a soulmate. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and at times so overwhelmingly emotional because of your more recent diagnosis in 2018, when you'd experienced several physical ailments that led to your diagnosis of ALS, which you're living with now. And again, the way you talk about life and death is profound and so beautiful and eloquent, and you talk about life and death in a way that I don't think we hear enough in the West. One of the reasons being because we see death as exclusively a loss, and you don't talk about it in that way.
It's like the ultimate insult,
Yeah, but you don't talk about it like that.
You should have. I've done one mistake recently. I had a combination 60th birthday party, farewell party, and funeral last Saturday.
Wow. I saw the video on Instagram.
I invited my closest 300 people, and it was so funny because, of course, I didn't have time to catch up with everybody. There's 300 people in 4 hours, But when I saw the video, it was so funny how many said, this is so weird, Hashtag should be mixed emotions, because I've never seen a party where there's so much crying, but I've never seen a party with so much singing and laughing and hand clapping. And I like that. It was like, this is human life, It can be wonderful. It can also be very, very painful. But it's like, as a Buddhist monk, we couldn't afford from shying away from the fact of physical death because there were so many reminders. So, our monastery was also the cremation ground. When the villages surrounding the monasteries, when somebody died, they brought them to the monastery, they lit a fire, we provided some chanting and ceremony. And so I've seen hundreds of bodies in open coffins just, burned to ash and a few scattered bones. And the Buddhist reflections that you do every day, they include the fact that these bodies are not permanent things. We're visitors, we have each other and this body on loan, and one day it's time to say farewell. And so I guess when I got the diagnosis, I tend to be a drama queen. If I would, describe myself in terms of temperament, looking back, I've been a bit of a drama queen. I identify more with my emotions than with my thinking process. But when I got the diagnosis, it was like, whoa, this is really interesting, I seem to be handling this a lot better than I would have expected to. And, I can't help but imagine that surely that must have something to do with 17 years of full-on training in a wisdom tradition that I love and respect for the rest of my days.
Yeah, because I guess the immediate feeling that comes up when the word death is spoken aloud is usually fear, but it seems that that's not necessarily the case with you today.
No, it's weird. I remember, there was of course lots of speeches and songs and people danced and it was like wild, from the youngest to the oldest. And I was very clear about the fact that at the end of it, I want 20 minutes where I speak to people, And so they wheeled me up in my wheelchair and I didn't have a plan, didn't know what to say, but I remember that it was an interesting, how do I say that? I heard myself say that I have not for one moment felt bitter about being given this particular cup, ALS. And I have never had a sense of unfairness around it. On the opposite, almost, after some, the initial shock and all, I had a sense of, well, I guess I may be better equipped for this journey than a lot of people. And it turns out I was. So that's unusual. And then 3 years ago, my father was given a terminal diagnosis because he smoked since he was 13, so it was no surprise to him. So me and my brothers and my mother, we took him to Switzerland, and he ended his life there because he didn't want to be, put in a hospital for long-term care, because that just doesn't suit his temperament at all. And so I'd been close to death in a very particular way with a very close person. And my father and I had this funny rapport where he's felt his whole life that when we die, it's the end. Curtains, blackness, end. And I've felt my whole life that, of course, it goes on into something else. Of course, it's the end, but it's also the beginning of something. I don't know what it's the beginning of, but I feel very convinced, and always have, that something ensues. And so that's very alive with me. So I don't know if it's shocking, but I can honestly say on one level, I'm an adventurer. I've always looked for extreme situations, like forest monk, bungee jumping, marathon runs without enough training beforehand and whatnot. So, I'm looking for the edges of my capacity and what happens when I'm in that. And so to me, on one level, there's the sadness of leaving everything I know as my life and my people behind, but there's also a sense of adventure, like something is starting soon, and I have no idea about what it is, but I'm very, very curious and interested.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I've acquired that attitude. I think it's just, I don't know, maybe I was born under a lucky star or something. To me, it seems very lucky at this point in life.
Yeah, it's so moving to hear you talk about it.
Thank you. Because it's like there's so many preconceived notions about death, I mean, I'm sitting planning my own funeral now. I've decided the venue. I've decided who's allowed to talk. It's a beautiful venue, but it's not a church because I want to keep it a bit more neutral. Even though I'm a member of the Swedish church and always have been, I've chosen a neutral, beautiful venue. And it brings me joy to think about it. And I want it to be, I wrote this morning, I wrote some of the, like you're supposed to indicate what to wear, And I thought, well, whatever you're comfortable in, but perhaps some glittery detail, do you say glittery in English?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. So it's weird. It gives me joy to, I'm making sure my testament is in place. I'm making sure my wife is financially secure.
Yeah.
I have the possibility to give gifts to people for various reasons. So I'm setting my house in order. I'm, death cleaning, if you like. And it gives me a sense of satisfaction. And I don't have a sense that life is incomplete and I would need 20 more years to be a happy human being. I feel that my life has contained 3 lives in one life. There was the before the monk life, there was the monk life, and was the after monk life. And all 3 lives have been much richer and more generous than I could possibly have imagined. I've been given a remarkable number of opportunities. And, I feel happy and good about my life. It ended at 60. Well, 60 is quite a lot. A lot of people don't get to see 60. I won't be around when this podcast is broadcast. I know that for a fact because I have a plan. I'm saying that to you in confidence, if you like, because you won't be broadcasting till mid-February or so.
Yeah. Oh. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, I feel you. I feel you. It's, I'm sure you can recognize it. It's almost like as death approaches, I'm sure you find it easy to imagine that it becomes even more important to stay in one's own truth. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
I don't have time to put the words in a way so that it's palatable to everybody and compromise too much. Now more than ever, I need to speak my own truth.
Yeah.
And for some reason, this is how I approach death. This is how I feel about it. And it feels important to voice that, if nothing else, just as a counterpoint to the kind of standard attitude of, death as the ultimate insult to human life.
That's why it's moved me so much, because it's such a beautiful, expansive way of us to talk about death. And it's something that all of us have more than likely dealt with on a very personal level, or, might even be considering our own departure. And it's so important for this conversation to be had, and I can't even express how grateful I am for you to be sharing that with all of us. I don't even know how to articulate how important I think that is, and how beautiful it is. And I feel unbelievably honoured to have had this conversation with you. This has been one of the most important conversations I think I've had. I've never met you. I was seriously floored by your book, but to talk to you is something else.
Yeah, wonderful, Fearne. Oh, that's very nice for me to hear, because it's I've never woken up getting out of bed thinking I'm the best thing that's happened since sliced bread. But of course, in Sweden now, there's because of the book and the speaking tour I did, this unprecedented attention on me as a person. And of course, I need to kind of pick the applause down a few notches, because at the end of the day, it sounds like I'm Jesus in some of the social media commentaries. And I know damn well, and if not, you can ask my wife, I'm not Jesus by any means. But it's lovely to be able to, reach somebody like yourself, a person I've never met. And because of my physical appearance being so haggard these days because of ALS, I chose not to have video, so we're just hearing each other, but still there's this sense of, oh, wonderful, she receives me, she understands me. But there's one thing we haven't spoken about, Fearne, which is very important.
Please, do tell.
I Googled your name this morning.
Oh, God.
And the first big news that comes up is that you're grieving a cat.
I am, Bjorn.
Of course you are. Of course you are. And you know what? Your cat that died is the spitting image of our cat.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. And, we got it a year and a half ago, and friends of ours, it just walked into their garden. It was obviously abandoned, in very poor shape, half dying, sustaining on insects, basically. And we came a week later, and it just connected with my wife incredibly. And when we were going to leave, it sat under my wheelchair. And so our friends said, "We think this is your cat. You want to take it home?" We've never had a cat. We've never considered having a cat. And of course, like any new cat owner, you become totally cat focused.
Of course.
And then, with my limitations, I weigh very little, and because of poor circulation, my hands are very cold and kind of bony. So the cat has connected more to my wife because she gives love all the time, and she's the one who feeds him. And so a week ago, I thought to myself, poof, there's not much time left now. What could I do to make my last period in life as enjoyable as possible? And I have 6 carers who give me 7/24 care. And one of them breeds cat as a side thing. And so on Saturday, a little Maine Coon kitten arrived at our home.
Wow.
And it's just like, I know people who don't have cats can't understand this, but in terms of heart openers, I don't know what can compare to a little furry kitten. I mean, it's just like, you want to have unconditional love for a while, well, get a kitten,
I know, they're the best. My cat that passed this week, I got her when I was 20 with another cat who luckily is still with me, and she's kind of obviously slightly confused about what's going on, but that was 20 years ago, and you just realise how loyal they are and how pure that love is. It's so uncomplicated and pure, and I feel so grateful that I got to have that friendship for so long, and I'm really, I was talking to my producer Anushka about this before we started recording. I'm really weirdly content in this period of grief because I feel really connected to her, and I almost don't want it to go at this stage because I feel her presence. I've had lots of little wonderful signs that have showed up, and and like you said, if you don't have an animal companion, cat or whatever animal it is, you might not understand the grief, or might even think it's over the top in comparison to a human loss. But it was such an unbelievably special bond that I had for 2 decades that, I am feeling it, and I'm just going with it. I'm just going with it at the moment. And I agree. I think, she's definitely gone off on a beautiful adventure somewhere, most definitely.
And it's like, in many people's lives, it's perhaps the most uncomplicated love,
it is
to an animal.
It's seriously beautiful.
It just doesn't get complicated.
No.
And also what I love about cats is like, they're never dishonest.
No.
And they never ever had the thought, what is he, she, they going to think about me or this?
No, they do what they want.
They just live their life, And you can like it or not like it or laugh at it, but they'll live their life.
They're also the best meditators out there. I watch my cat sit there meditating for hours, just looking at one point in complete bliss, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
You know Eckhart Tolle?
Yeah, I love Eckhart.
Yeah, I've kind of followed him for a long while and seen him live. And in one of his books, he writes, "I've had 9 spiritual teachers. All of them have been cats."
Oh, wow. I didn't know that about him. That's so wonderful. That's so wonderful. Oh, Bjorn, I don't even know what to say. I'll close the chat in the way that I started it by saying thank you. And it's a truly wholehearted thank you for the book, for taking time to talk to me today, for the stories that you've shared, for the thoughts and the wisdom that you've imparted. I won't ever forget this chat. So thank you.
Wonderful. I won't either, Fearne. It was a real pleasure talking to a real human being. I really enjoyed that. I need this too, you know. My life is not so much fun anymore, but this kind of conversation makes me come alive. So this was very, very enjoyable for me too.